Religions were a means by which the priests or the people who had the sacred knowledge could control the masses. So what they do is they take away the true essence of knowledge of connection to oneness from the people. Now you can't get it unless you come through me, because I'm going to take all the sources from it away from you. But not only can't you not get it from me, is I'm going to play around with it and encode it in such a way that unless you're initiated by me into understanding the code, then you're going to read it one way and not the way it's really meant. So it's written in two ways, so that only the initiated can understand the symbologies behind it. So let's look at the first. I'm not going to go to the ancient Egyptian mystery schools and what happened with the whole tracing of the Tat Brotherhood, or the Babylon Brotherhood as David Icke calls it, and then how it got distorted by the Amun priests. The Amun priests pulled it in one direction and for their own corrupt methods, and then where it went and everywhere. I'll go to the first religion. First religion was Judaism, and there was no Hebrew tribe, and all of this is all constructed. But let's understand the facts of who Moses really was, because the first 5 chapters of the Old Testament were supposedly written by Moses. But who was Moses? We know that he was in an Egyptian family, an Egyptian royal family. We know that he was supposedly found on a river as a baby. Well, that story goes back to Sargon in the Sumerians era. So that's a borrowed story. So who was he really, and how did that religion came about? Is that there was a vizier, and at the time of around about 1600 BC, curiously enough, there was a division in Egypt. And Lower Egypt, or the northern part if we look at it, was ruled by invaders from the east called the Hyksos, or sometimes referred to as the Habaru. And you can see how Habaru can be distorted to Hebrew. And in the southern part of Egypt, or Upper Egypt, was the descendants of the original Egyptians who had the true sacred knowledges. So there were 2 pharaohs. The pharaoh in the north was a pharaoh called Apopi, and he had a vizier called Joseph, who was one of these Habaru invaders from the east. Now Joseph is the Joseph we know as Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, okay, the Joseph who had all the dreams. And Joseph was sent by his pharaoh to go to southern Egypt to get the sacred knowledge from the southern pharaoh, Sequenera. He had the ancient rituals of resurrection. So he had the true sacred knowledge of what was really going on. And the northern one didn't have it. So he wanted to feel that he was a true pharaoh and have this resurrection right. So he said to Joseph, I need to get this information. Joseph sent 2 of his brothers down to southern Egypt to see the pharaoh to get the information. And they finished up murdering Sequenera, because they couldn't get it. They were angry with him. They tried to beat it out of him and they killed him. And there's a great book called The Hiram Key by Christopher Knight and Jonathan Lomas, I think it is, which details that, because they were actually trying to find the origins of Freemasonry. So they found a lot of these clues there. And what they found was that Joseph, in fact, had ordered his brothers to go down there and get this information. The next bit of information they didn't have was what happened next. What happened was the southern pharaohs, the son of Sequenera, Kamos, there was a civil war. They wanted revenge for the death of their father. So they caused an uprising against the northern pharaoh. And a civil war ensued. And Joseph, because they were losing, packed up his bags, stole as much gold as he could, and took about 6,000 other Habaru people, invaders, and they fled Egypt, chased by now the pharaoh from the south, Kamos. And they fled at the very same time that the volcanic eruption in Santorini was going off. Okay, so these things were linked together. And that link was happening at the same time as Nibiru was passing through. So all of these events were happening at the one time, 1600 BC. Joseph flees with all of the gold and all of those bits, and he also took with him a cabinet, which they call an ark, which inside it had a giant crystal that used to sit inside the so-called sarcophagus inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid. So he stole this crystal because it had incredible transmitting powers inside this ark. This is the Ark of the Covenant. So he steals this crystal, and the Egyptians are furious about this, not just because he's killed the southern pharaoh, but for other reasons, obviously, because he's stolen it. So they get chased across, and he goes, and most people think that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula, you know, where Moses went to get the Ten Commandments. It's not. It's in Saudi Arabia. It's across the Red Sea. And there's evidence there. It was discovered in 1984, and if you go onto YouTube, you can actually see footage of the people who discovered it and images of it. It's in Saudi Arabia. So Joseph goes across and he flees, and the Pharaoh gets trapped in one of the tsunamis that goes through and kills him. His younger brother, Ahmose, then sets up the beginning of the 18th dynasty. Okay? But Joseph's now fled and he's across the water, and he's trying to keep control because he's used to being in control, and he's a megalomaniac. And he's got all of these people who are on the verge of internal fighting. Where are we going to go? What are we going to do? So he goes to the top of the mountain there, and there's a Midianite god in that area. And the Midianite god is a god of revenge and anger and all of these things. So he goes to the top of the mountain, and he says, what am I going to do to control all of these people? So he says, I know what I'm going to do. And he chisels out onto 2 stone tablets 7 commandments. Not 10, 7. 1 for each day of the week. And if you look at the 10 commandments, 7 of them are day-to-day things, and 3 of them are big ones, like thou shalt have no other God but me, thou shalt worship no other idols but me, and I can't remember what the third one is. So there's 7 day-to-day ones, and there's 3 basic ones. So he chisels out 7 of them, and he chisels them out in Egyptian hieroglyphics, because Egyptian hieroglyphics are the words of the gods. And he comes down off the mountain, and he finds they've melted down the gold into a golden calf, and they worship one of the old images from Egypt. And he's furious because he doesn't have control anymore. So he smashes the tablets and said, you're going to be smitten by this God that I met up there, who's this God of revenge and evil and does all of this, which is what the Christian or the Jewish God is, which is a Midianite God. So he then says, I'm going to go back up to the top of the mountain, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to negotiate with God for your salvation. So he goes back up to the top of the mountain, but this time he takes with him a whole lot of parchment, because he realizes he's going to have more rules. So he goes to the top of the mountain, and this time he chisels out 10. The 7 he had before, and 3 more. You shall worship no other God but me. You shall have no idols. You know, there's the big 3. He adds those in, and he writes down a whole lot of pedantic little stuff, which becomes the basis of the Torah and all of their rules that they have. And he comes down off the mountain. He says, here's the 10 commandments, and here's all of the other rules that you have to have. And I am now called Moses. Moses meaning born of. That's what it means. It's an Egyptian name that means born of. We don't know born of who, but he says, I'm born of the God or whatever. And he becomes the ruler because he's the keeper. And that's how Judaism came about. Christianity is a different thing. Christianity was, and we have to understand first of all who Jesus was. Now Jesus was a real person and wasn't a real person, okay? Because the stuff that you read in the Bible goes back to 12, 13, 14 other religions going back 1,500 years before Christianity. The whole birth story comes from a whole lot of different things. Everything about Jesus that's in the Bible comes from somewhere else. It's all been made up. But was there a particular person that those stories talk about? And yes, there was, but we have to understand who that person really was and why things happened the way they did. So let's look at who Jesus was called. He had the title, the Son of God and the King of Kings. Now, the title, the Son of God, comes from Egypt. It was a title reserved for the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was called the Son of God. And the title, the King of Kings, had its origins from the Roman Empire, in particular Caesar. He was the King of Kings. He was the ruler of the Roman Empire. Okay? There's only ever been one person in history who had the title Son of God, King of Kings. And that person was the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. And his name was Caesarion. And he was born around about 40 odd BC. We can't say exactly the date because there were 3 different calendars going on, but we know around that period he was born. And when Caesar was murdered, Augustus sent out assassins to kill Caesarion, to kill the offspring of Caesar, so that Augustus could be the rightful heir. And while Caesarion was still alive, Caesarion was the rightful heir to the Roman Empire. So Augustus sent out people to kill him. And there are 2 reports. One says that Caesarion was killed, and another one that says that he escaped. Now, if you were sent out by Caesar to say, did you kill him? You would come back saying, oh, yes, he's dead. Because if you didn't achieve your goal, you're going to be killed. Do you remember in Snow White when the Queen sends the woodcutter out to get the heart, and he can't do it, but he comes back with another heart and says, yes, yes, I did it. It's the same thing. Cleopatra is totally aware of what's going on, so she sends Caesarion, who is then a child of about 11 and 12, away to the Far East in the protection of her 2 most trusted servants, male and female, and they become foster parents to Caesarion. And he goes off to the Far East, and there are documents saying that Caesarion arrived in Nepal and studied Buddhism, or studied the Hindu teachings, because Buddhism came later, but studied the Vedic teachings of the ancient Sumerians and all of that, in Nepal for about 25 years, 20 years or something like that. And in that time, changed his name to Iesu. Pretty powerful stuff, isn't it, that someone would do that? Then went back to Egypt when he was 30, where he sought out his half-sister, because Cleopatra had had twins to Mark Antony and then another son as well. So the twins were Cleopatra Selina and Ptolemy Philometor, or 15 I think it was, I can't remember which was which. And they were twins. So he goes back and he finds them and he marries his half-sister, which was the custom of the ancient Egyptians, because that kept everything in the bloodline. Because all of this sacred knowledge was inherited through the female of the race in the DNA. Okay, that's a whole other story. So we get this situation. He goes back and he marries his half-sister, and he has a half-brother who is a twin. Okay, now there's all this speculation that Jesus had a twin brother. And it says it's in the Bible. And so people say, oh, Jesus had a twin brother. No, he had a brother who was a half-brother who was a twin of his wife, who was his half-sister. Okay, so here they then go off to Jerusalem, because where is he going to try and put this new teaching, this new understanding he has through? He's the rightful ruler of the Roman and Egyptian empires. So that whole region he's the rightful ruler to, and he has an incredible philosophy of love and sharing and all of that. So he goes with his sister and his half-brother, a sister who's his wife, and they go to Jerusalem or to Qumran, and they form the core of the Essenes and their teachings.